A warm welcome to all of you, and we welcome James once more on the channel. It's a pleasure. We've learned so much from you, James, that it feels so nice to have you time and time again back on the channel. So today, what are we going to learn?
I learned something today. Well, we're doing two. I'm serious. I learned something major today. So today we're going to look at two scientists' charts, Alexander Fleming and Albert Einstein. I knew nothing about Alexander Fleming, to be honest, and I did some research on him. So he was the man who discovered penicillin by accident. He, well, first of all, let me go back a little bit. He was in the war, in World War I, and he noticed that when the soldiers had a superficial wound, the doctors would put antiseptic on that wound. And he noticed that if the wounds were superficial, the antiseptic would cure it and make it better. But he noticed that when the wounds were deeper, the antiseptic would actually kill the soldiers. And he begged the army doctors to stop giving this kind of antiseptic. He said, please, this is killing them. They wouldn't listen. So lots of people died. After the war, he came back and he was studying, but he specifically wanted to do research into bacteria because he had seen so many soldiers die of it. So in September of 1928, he was working in his petri dish, and he had different things in there, and he woke up the next morning, September 28th, and he noticed that whatever had been in there killed the other bacteria. So he called it mold juice. He called what he eventually termed penicillin, he originally called it mold juice. And he noticed that it could kill other bacteria. However, he spent years and years and years trying to make use of this penicillin and could not do it. He gave up in 1940, and then as soon as he gave up, there were two other scientists or doctors that had heard about his work. When he put out his original work, he wrote some papers on penicillin. Nobody cared. They ignored it. It made no difference. But these two scientists or doctors saw it, and they started working with it. They've been working with it 4 or 5 years. This was 1945 was when they got it in 1940, and they were able to make the penicillin so that soldiers in World War II didn't die because they had developed it. At some point, Fleming heard about these two guys and went to see them, and they told these doctors, hey, Alexander Fleming's coming to see you. And they said, Fleming's coming? I thought he was dead. They thought he was dead. Anyway, so I told you this story specifically because it relates to the horoscope massively. So can we put Alexander Fleming's chart up?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. So
I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. It's raining in my side of the country, and so there is a power cut.
Okay, so when I do astrology, as everybody knows, I take the basics. It is the basics. You have to understand what the planets mean and what the houses mean. The yogas are very flashy and they're very interesting and all the different secretive techniques, but if you have the basics, you'll be able to do this. Now, so this is a little bit, tricky the way the horoscopes are on the screen because you're not really, able to see the degrees, but I mean, you can't see the degrees in the horoscope. But I'm going to tell you, when I looked at this horoscope, the first thing that stood out massively was Saturn. Saturn is fallen, but it happens to be fallen in the worst degree of fall, the 20th degree of Aries. So this is something, I started out as a Western astrologer, and when I saw planets were fallen, they were bad. If they were exalted, they were very good. But when I got to India, they said in the sidereal zodiac, in Jyotish, Saturn is exalted in the 20th degree. It's fallen it's exalted in the 20th degree of Libra. It's fallen in the 20th degree of Aries. That means Saturn's bad in Aries, gets worse in 10 degrees, worse in 15. By the time it hits 19 degrees and some minutes, that's when it is in the 20th degree. His Saturn is 19 degrees and 55 minutes. This is incredibly close to that worst point, okay? So, just to tell you, when he hit his first Saturn sub-period, he was 7 years old, and guess what happened? His father died. Now, this fascinated me because what I was looking for with the 11th house was brothers and sisters. So, mainly, sorry, not brothers and sisters, eldest sibling. I was looking to see, did he have an eldest sibling who died? I couldn't find enough material about him. I know he had some siblings. It never said on the internet that he had a brother a sibling that died, but it's quite possible that his parents may have had a miscarriage before
He was.
his other, So you understand the way to do astrology, not just to hear what I say, but when I look at that Saturn and I look at the 11th house, I think about everything that the 11th house represents. You must do that. You must go to the books, find out what does the 11th house represent. Every single feature that it represents, that's what's going to get affected here, the 11th house. And Saturn, you have to know everything that Saturn represents, because that's also going to be affected, because Saturn is this highly fallen planet. So now the 11th house ruler is actually quite strong. Mars is in the 12th house, which makes it look very weak, and it's in Taurus, which is opposite its own sign Scorpio, so it looks weak. But Mars is 8 degrees away from Jupiter, and that is strengthening Mars. So the 11th house has some strength, but having the two most intense influences, I've said this over and over, is a stationary planet is massively strong, and a planet in its highest degree of exaltation, massively strong. Worst degree of fall is massively terrible. Just like Hillary Clinton hit the sun dasha, it's in the 10th degree of Libra, fallen. She didn't win the election, that's why. Okay, so the 11th house is eldest sibling, so I was looking at that. The 11th house is major goals and desires. The desire houses are 3, 7, and 11. Those are the desire houses. But the 3rd and the 7th are the daily desires. Can you get something done on a daily basis? If Saturn's in the 3rd house, you go shopping, everybody decides they're going to go shopping that day. So it slows you down. Those are the daily desires. The 11th house is the major goals and desires. The more Hillary Clinton wanted to win, the more she couldn't. The more this man wanted to use this invention, the more he couldn't succeed. The problem that he found with the penicillin was that he could not figure out how to stabilize it. What planet would make something stable?
Saturn.
Saturn.
Right.
Also, he couldn't figure out how to mass produce it. What do you need to mass produce anything? Organization. Organization. Okay? Another thing about the Saturn, and this I have to tell you, this is 40 years of experience, and today something finally clicked when I was studying this. I have said in my YouTubes, I have no trouble analyzing mother in a horoscope. The 4th house, moon, and Mercury. And most astrologers forget to look at Mercury, but Mercury is a karaka of mother. If you want to be accurate, you've got to use them all. With the father, I would use the sun as the main karaka for father. And I would get confused because it could be the 9th house being father. If you're from South India, the 9th house is father. because the father is in South India, they consider that your father is your guru. So the ninth house becomes father, right? A couple months ago, I don't know why it took me so long, but it did. A couple months ago, I was thinking about the father in a horoscope. And one of the things that I've noticed over the decades is that many times Jupiter winds up representing the father. So I'm looking at ninth house, 10th house, and the sun. But if Jupiter is terrible, father's got problems. If Jupiter is really good, that's helping the father. Still, it's too confusing because you got the ninth house and the 10th house. Today, I said, wait a minute. He entered at 7 years old, the Saturn Bhukti, and his father died? Bingo. Saturn is the rulership of authority figures. And if you're looking at the 10th house, you must look at Saturn. So in the same way that Jupiter is the father for people in South India that are using the ninth house, if you're using the 10th house for father, you've also got to look at Saturn. And then I thought about my Saturn. My Saturn is aspected exactly to the degree by Jupiter. I've always thought of my father as a saint. I remember once when I was about 20 or 30, I met this older guy who knew my father when my father was in his 30s. And this guy said, your father was such a fine man. And I knew that. I, of course, knew that. That's the Jupiter aspecting that Saturn. My father also had a very difficult life, and that's the Jupiter getting hurt by Saturn. Anyway, the point is, now we have another piece of information for the father. Ninth house and Jupiter, 10th house and Saturn, and of course the sun. So, it's very interesting because this man he's very humble. This man's very humble, Alexander Fleming. And he, when people would try to credit him, they gave him a Nobel Prize and they gave him awards. And when people, said that he called it something, the Fleming myth, that I had invented it. I just found it. These guys figured out how to use it. So he looked at it that way. One other thing before I get to that first house. So Saturn, so the 11th house is eldest sibling. The 11th house is major goals and desires. The 11th house is large sums of money that come in. So the second house is money that you earn, okay? The 11th house is large sums of money that can come in every so often. From, you sell a house and a big chunk comes in. You have some business on the side, money from side ventures, large sums of money. Very interesting story. This man, after he was famous, came to America and was giving some lectures. It didn't say who gave him this money, but somebody simply, I don't know if it's an organization or a wealthy man, they said, we want to give you $100,000. You did such a great service to mankind by discovering penicillin. He looked at the $100,000 and he said, I can't take this, but I'll donate it to the hospital where I work, right? So why couldn't he accept it? The 11th house, which is large sums of money,
has an ability to.
It must have seemed totally absurd to be given a large sum of money. It just was unnatural. Anyway, I found that interesting. Now, so it's very interesting. The more he wanted to accomplish something, the more he'd be blocked. But look at the first house. The first house is Gemini, and the first house has the Yoga Karaka Venus in the first. That's a very, very nice placement.
Can I ask you just one question here, James? So if anybody has a debilitated planet, so supposing somebody has a debilitated planet in the fourth house, so the more the person wants to build a big house or get very comfortable with a mother or feel secure in the emotions, does it work like that?
Yes. If you have a debilitated planet in the fourth house, you have trouble in the fourth house. So see, this is where I'm saying, instead of listening to me so much, listen, of course, but go to your books and memorize what the fourth house is. Let's say I have a horoscope I'm doing tomorrow or the next day, where Venus is in the 27th degree of Virgo. Okay. Now, I forget what house it is, but let's say that that's in the 4th house. Trouble with mother, trouble with educational degrees, trouble with happiness in the heart, trouble with the physical heart, trouble with endings. A person has that when they have a divorce, it's bitter. Another person has Jupiter exalted or exalted planet in the 4th, they have a divorce, they end as friends. The endings go well. Fallen planet in the 4th, the endings are bad. Okay? Happiness in the heart and the physical heart. See, this is what I mean. You have to memorize everything that the house is. Now, when you do that, the client may not say, yes, they're all bad with that fallen, but several of them will be bad. So you mention them all because you're not God, you're not psychic. So you mention them all and you'll find out which ones are hitting the mark. Okay? So he has Venus, the Yoga Karaka, in the 1st house. That's going to be very, very good for fame and recognition, right? And if you look at Mercury, Mercury is in 2 degrees Cancer, but the ascendant is 24 Gemini. So that Mercury, it's in the 2nd house, but it's also in the 1st house. So those are very good placements. So this man had confidence. He had confidence because the 1st house is good and he could gain fame and recognition. He just couldn't accomplish. The more he wanted it, the harder it would be to get. Now, in the same way that a fallen planet is bad, it aspects its opposite sign, and that's going to be good. So Saturn is not just aspecting the 5th house, the house of the mind, in its exaltation placement. So that's Saturn aspecting, excuse me, that's Saturn aspecting the 5th house, the house of children and the house of the mind, is aspecting not just its exaltation sign, but the 20th degree of Libra, the highest point of exaltation. What does that tell you about his intellect?
Very, very strong.
Very, very strong. Now, the Purva Punya, the past life credit, the 5th house is Purva Punya. So the Purva Punya is the 5th house ruler in the 1st house. So his past life credit is with confidence and gaining recognition and gaining fame and such. He only had 1 child. That's, even though Saturn's aspecting his exaltation, highest exaltation, only had 1 child. But the Saturn aspecting the 5th house, you can have, like in Einstein's chart, the ruler of the 5th house is Venus. It's the best planet in his horoscope. It's exalted in the 25th degree of Pisces. So his intellect was great. But it's a different kind of intellect. Fleming's is more Saturnian. Saturn's aspecting, so the mind is being organized, the mind is being deep, the mind is being slow. Those kind of
the mind is also stable.
Yes. Stable. Now here's the other thing. When I'm looking for scientists in the Western system, it's Uranus. Both of these people in the Western chart, Einstein and Fleming, they both have Uranus in the 3rd house of the Western chart. Now you're all thinking brothers and sisters and, energy and the hands. In the Western system, the 3rd house is the mind. And Einstein was massively independent minded. He didn't care he broke all the rules mentally.
Yes.
They both have Uranus in the 3rd house, so their minds are very open. In the Hindu system, if any planet represents science, it's Rahu. And Einstein has Rahu and Mars in Capricorn conjunct. He has Rahu and Moon. Rahu is 22 Scorpio, Moon is 28 Scorpio, and Rahu's also aspected by Jupiter and by Mars. But I want to talk about something else that's fascinating. You talk about scientists. These are people that have to be sitting in a room alone, researching stuff, going deep, and researching. Same as astrologers. Eighth house. Eighth house. Now watch this. This is something that I was thinking about. I decided that I'm going to go to the next Vedic Astrology conference in Sedona. And so I thought, what am I going to teach? And I thought, I'm going to try to teach things that I didn't know in my first or second decade of astrology. And I can't even imagine what I would have thought 20 or 30 years ago, noticing that the first thing I noticed, and this really scared me, I said, wait a minute, the eighth house is research, and his eighth house ruler is Saturn. It's fallen to the worst degree. How can he do any research? Now watch this. Saturn aspects the eighth house, and it's aspecting its own sign, number one. Sun is aspecting the eighth house, number two. Mercury's aspecting the eighth house, number three. Ketu is aspecting the eighth house, number four. Jupiter is aspecting the fifth house. 5 planets aspecting the fifth house. At first glance, I said,
Eighth house.
Eighth house. At first glance, I said, how could this guy do any research? The ruler of the eighth is toast. It's destroyed. But the eighth house is being aspected by 5 planets. And Saturn is one of them, which is good because it's its own sign. Jupiter's a great. So in September of 1928, that was when he accidentally discovered the penicillin. And the 1928 was a very, 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 very good period because it was Mars dasha and Jupiter bhukti. Mars dasha, Jupiter bhukti. So why is this good? It's good because Mars is 8 degrees away from Jupiter. Now, had that been Jupiter Mars, it would be bad. Jupiter's running its dasha, and Mars, the malefic, hits it, no good, hurts Jupiter. Mars Jupiter, Mars picks up the good energy of Jupiter. So Mars rules the 11th house. So in that period, he's been looking and trying to find something, some way that he can help, because he needs to find a way to fix this bacteria problem. And that's when it happens, Mars Jupiter. Also, in relation to Einstein, Einstein's a scientist, he's a scientist. But notice that he has the moon and Rahu in the 6th house. He has a very powerful 6th house. Even though the moon is fallen, yes, the moon is fallen, and yes, Rahu's a malefic. But look at what you've got. Moon in the 6th, Rahu in the 6th. That's a lot of medical energy, interest in medical. And then you have Mars aspecting its own sign, Scorpio. Then you have Jupiter aspecting the 6th. So this is a 6th house chart. So medicine was his first, that's what he did first. He became a doctor. Then he went into the research and all that.
Yes.
Also, it's very important to understand that with the sun and the moon, they are so important. The moon is the essence of the horoscope and the ascendant ruler or the ascendant. That's the essence. So even if the moon is afflicted, the person is still going to be interested in that area. Now, if the moon is in the 3rd or 2nd degree of Scorpio, the worst point of the moon is 3rd degree of Scorpio, that's going to be wretched. That's going to be very, very, very rough. But generally, if the sun or the moon or even the ascendant ruler is afflicted, whatever house it's in is still going to be a major area of influence. So, so the moon in the 6th house, this is something that is extremely important because it gives the ability to want to be a perfectionist and to be very detailed oriented. You see many, many, many people with moon in the 6th house. I think Einstein had that too. Yeah, Einstein had the same thing, fallen moon in Scorpio in the 6th house.
Yes.
So that gives detail work, perfectionist tendencies, and things like that. Now, there's an interesting point that I'm going to make when I get to Einstein's chart, but I'm going to mention it in relationship to Fleming. Fleming has a very nice first house, okay, because the Yoga Karaka, Venus, is there, and then the Mercury is not in great. There's nothing great about Mercury. It's aspected by Rahu. It's aspected by the Sun, but they're far aspects. They're not close. They're far away. But Mercury still has a first house influence. It is 8 degrees away from the ascendant degree.
Right.
So that's close to the first. So he's got a good first house. So when they gave him awards, he was present. When we get to Einstein's chart, you're going to see a first house that is so massively afflicted because it's ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is fallen, conjunct Saturn, that when they gave Einstein the Nobel Prize, he was abroad and couldn't accept it. This is an interesting fact because it happened that something, not the Nobel Prize, but something similar happened to me. I have a very weak first house. The first house ruled by Venus. Venus is 1 degree from Ketu, 2 degrees from the 12th ruler Mars. The first house is wiped out. And I never won awards. I watch other people win awards and win prizes. That never happened to me. And at some point, I went to a Vedic Astrology conference, and Dennis Harness was kind enough to say, let's give James a special award, right? Now, this is something I can tell you, I would have loved this. I would have loved this because this was all the people that had read my book going, oh, there's the great James, right? So it was a conference of like 3 or 4 days. We met some palmist astrologer there, and I said, oh, I would like to get a reading. So he said, well, the only time I can do it is Saturday night. So I said, well, we'll skip the large meeting and we'll go for the palmistry reading. So they gave this great award, and I wasn't present. That's what happens when the first house is weak. It's very difficult to get recognition. I get recognition because the 10th house is strong, not the first. But this guy, as far as he's concerned, he would always say, you're giving me too much attention. These other guys were the ones that developed it. Okay, I just accidentally found it. Now, another thing. I want to talk about Venus a little bit because we're going to talk about that a lot with Einstein. Venus is, of course, art, beauty, music, mathematics, things like that, math. Venus makes a person kind-hearted. Never forget that. If a person has an angular Venus or an exalted Venus, as long as it's not massively afflicted, the person will always be kind. And this man was very, very kind-hearted.
He was.
Yeah.
He was. So, James, I would like to ask you a few questions here. So, when you said, we go back to that one thing that you said, that if you have he has a Saturn, which is in the exact degree of fall, if you can say so. So, he had many obstacles. So, if somebody has Mars in the exact degree of fall, that Mars will say in the 6th house. So that Mars could be the reason why he could not get a proper job, or he faces a lot of problems in his obstacles in getting work done.
You have to look at
the word that I would need a little clarification on.
Obstacles?
You said that the more he wanted to work, discover, the more obstacles or the blocks that he came across. So
I wouldn't necessarily use the word obstacles. I would just say that the more he wants it, the less he's going to be able to get it.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that Hillary Clinton had obstacles. Hillary Clinton didn't have obstacles. The more she wanted it, the more nature would figure out how she should not get it. Because
so can I just ask another question here? So is that mean that you have to either live with it or you have to break through it and find a way out?
You're not going to find a way out of this problem.
Okay.
I mean, look, if you want to talk about Mercury and you say, oh, his Mercury is a little afflicted, it's aspected by Rahu, it's aspected by the sun, then I would say, let's work on Mercury, let's make Mercury stronger. You're not going to fix a planet in the worst degree of its fall and with no mitigating very good aspects. That Saturn is burnt. He probably had teeth problems. He probably had problems with his bones. He probably had some friends that died or did not have good friends, things like that. Group activity when he was in the war with the other doctors, the group, they wouldn't listen to him. Now, of course, if I was with a client, I would say, do Saturn yagyas all your life, keep pictures of Lord Shiva around the house, keep Saturdays as a restful day. But if he asked me how much benefit is that going to give, I'd say, well, that's up to God, of course, but I would never expect a tremendous amount of change. It's too afflicted. There's nothing helping.
I'm getting your point. I'm getting your point loud and clear. Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is that we have to learn to live with it. Remedials will work in such a case, but how much can never be defined by anybody, because that has to be left at the will of the divine. That's what you're saying. Acceptance and then moving ahead and taking it just right.
Look, this is the way life is. You cannot, as I said in one of the readings before, one day I tried to make a perfect chart. You couldn't do it. All the exalted planets would aspect the opposite houses and destroy them. You can't do it. So everybody has karma. It's just a question of how bad it is, a lot of times you'll see a planet and it's very mixed. It's just mixed. There's some good, some bad. This is not mixed. This is totally bad. I can't find anything good about it.
Okay. So on that topic of yours, when you say that, on one such day, you would want to make a good planet and chart, and then you put all the planets in the sign of exaltation, which Lord Rama had. We will take you up on discussion with his chart on Sunday.
Well, the problem with Rama's chart, the one my teacher mentioned me, was, look, the sun is exalted in Aries and Saturn's exalted in Libra. His father died when he was 20 or something. His father died too early.
Yeah.
But this is a fascinating chart. And of course, the sun and Mercury in the second house means that he would love education. Now, that Mercury in the second house served him very well because it's the quintessential placement of teaching. So when he became famous, he would go around speaking, and he would be a good speaker because of that Mercury in the second house. He loves knowledge because of Sun Mercury in the house of knowledge, but Mercury in the second makes a person very good with words. There's a very interesting story about Fleming. I knew nothing about this man. I mean nothing, but I'm reading as quick as I can to try and learn. When he was a child, he bumped into some kid and crushed his nose. And I thought, flattened his nose, just crushed it. I wonder if that's related to Saturn being the teeth and the bones. It's not exactly a bone, but he crushed it.
Okay. Okay, so much on that, but one last word.
Wait, one other thing. The ninth house is ruled by Saturn.
Yes.
And there's no good aspects onto the ninth house. Nothing. The ruler of the ninth is Saturn. It's fallen. And that could be also the father dying as the ruler of the ninth. But also, this would mean that with religion, this is not a good chart for religion and philosophy because of the ninth house being ruled by Saturn. And also Jupiter in the 12th, aspected by Mars and Ketu. So religion, not good.
Yeah, so he never believed in much in religion, but he believed a lot in humanity. He believed a lot in humanity.
That's the Venus. That was why I mentioned when I started finding out about the humanity business, because in Einstein's chart, he was such a humanitarian, that's the Venus. But Einstein's Venus is way better than this Venus. So let's move to Einstein.
Yeah, we will. So before we move on to Einstein's chart, we will take a break here and we will continue on with Einstein's chart in the next part of the same series. Till then, have a nice time.